the 6th of June, 1944, somewhere over Normandy, mid-morning. The sky over the invasion coast is the most crowded piece of airspace in the history of warfare, something close to 12,000 Allied aircraft moving through it in a single day, and one of them is a P-51B Mustang named Jerry, marked QP-G, flown by 2nd Lieutenant Thomas E. Fraser of the 334th Fighter Squadron, 4th Fighter Group, out of Debden in Essex. Fraser is 22 years old, from Atlanta, Georgia, flying with a unit whose lineage runs back to the 3 all-American volunteer squadrons that flew for the Royal Air Force before the United States had even entered the war, absorbed into the 8th Air Force as the 4th Fighter Group less than 2 years earlier. His formation is flying a fighter sweep inland from the beaches. The weather is closing in, visibility is dropping, and somewhere east of Rouen, the formation changes course in the murk, and Fraser's Mustang does not come home with it. He goes down largely intact. He is taken prisoner within hours, on the single busiest day of the war for the side he is fighting for. Before he is marched away from the wreck of his own airplane, Fraser does something small and, in its way, defiant. According to the account later given by the German test pilot who would fly the aircraft, Fraser left the cockpit radio switched on as he abandoned it, so that any of his squadron mates still overhead, still listening on the frequency, would hear German voices moving in around the set and know exactly what had happened to him and to his airplane. Pause on that sentence. A 22-year-old prisoner, in the middle of being captured on the most consequential day of the war, still found a way to send one last piece of information back to his own side before the war took his freedom for the rest of it. His airplane would spend the remainder of 1944 doing the opposite job, in the other uniform. The 4th Fighter Group's own history was itself a small piece of Anglo-American engineering and improvisation, long before anyone at Rechlin cared about the airplane it flew. The group had been formed in September 1942 by folding 3 all-volunteer American squadrons that had flown Spitfires for the Royal Air Force, the Eagle Squadrons, into the newly arriving 8th Air Force. Uniforms and command structure changing, while the men and, for a while, the aircraft stayed largely the same. By June 1944, the group had passed through Spitfires and briefly Thunderbolts before converting to the Mustang, so that Fraser's cockpit that morning sat at the end of a lineage that had been mixing British and American flying culture since 1940. The man who pushed that conversion through was the group's combative commander, Colonel Don Blakesley, who by most accounts had little patience for pilots reluctant to give up the rugged Thunderbolt for an unfamiliar new type in the run-up to the invasion, and who is widely quoted as having told them they could learn to fly the Mustang on the way to the target. Whether or not he used those exact words, the 4th Fighter Group converted fast, and Fraser was flying one of the new airplanes within months of it arriving on the squadron's line. This is not a story about one fighter sweep that went wrong in bad visibility over Normandy. By June 1944, the Luftwaffe already knew the name Mustang, the way a boxer knows the name of the opponent who has been beating him for months without ever quite letting him see the punch coming. What the German High Command did not have, in any numbers worth mentioning, was an intact one to put on a scale, strip to the rivets, and fly. This is the story of Jerry, the P-51B captured whole on D-Day, and of what Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche found when Rechlin finally got its hands on the airplane that had already been quietly deciding the outcome of the air war for months. Part 1. To understand why an intact Mustang mattered so much to the Luftwaffe in the summer of 1944, you have to understand what the aircraft had already done to German fighter pilots without ever being closely examined by German engineers. Through the autumn and winter of 1943, the bomber escort had still been a fight the Luftwaffe could win at the edges, at the limit of an escort fighter's range, over Belgium or the German frontier, where the little friends had to turn for home and the bombers were left to fend for themselves. Beginning that winter and hardening through Big Week in February 1944 and the deep raids that followed, that limit kept moving east, mission by mission, until escort fighters were reaching Berlin itself and coming back. During the single week of concentrated raids, the 8th Air Force called Big Week, the 20th to the 25th of February, 1944, American bombers and their escorts claimed several hundred German fighters destroyed, a level of attrition the Jagdwaffe's training schools could not replace pilot for pilot, let alone experience for experience. The aircraft doing most of that reaching was the Mustang, flying on drop tanks that let it stay with the bomber stream for the whole mission, rather than a fraction of it. German fighter pilots met the type constantly by mid-1944, in the worst possible way, at altitude, in numbers, flown by men who by then had more flying hours than the Germans rising to meet them. German engineers, by contrast, had almost nothing to put on a test stand, because most of the Mustangs the Luftwaffe encountered went down the way fighters usually go down in a war, shot up, burning, broken across a field, of no conceivable use to anyone's flight test department. An airplane that came down whole, on its own gear, with its logbook still in the cockpit, was a genuinely rare gift. Rarer even than the captured Thunderbolt this channel has already told the story of, and rarer still on a day when the entire German defensive apparatus in Normandy was absorbing the largest single blow of the war. Part 2. Before Lerche ever touched the controls, the aircraft had already lived through one transformation that had nothing to do with Germany at all. The Mustang began in 1940 as a rush order from the British Purchasing Commission to North American Aviation and its chief, James Howard Kindleberger, who offered to design an entirely new fighter rather than build another country's design under license, and did it, by the traditional and often repeated account, with a prototype rolled out in around 117 days, a figure historians still argue over slightly, depending on whether you count from contract signature or design start, but which was, by any account, remarkably fast. That first airplane, powered by an Allison V1710 engine with a single-stage supercharger, was fast and beautifully behaved down low, built around a new laminar flow wing developed with the American National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics that produced far less drag than conventional airfoils of the day. The Royal Air Force used the early Mustang exactly as its engine allowed, as the Mustang Mark I, a tactical reconnaissance and low-level fighter, because above about 15,000 feet the Allison ran out of breath, and the airplane's real aerodynamic gifts went almost entirely to waste. What changed that was a 30-minute flight in April 1942 at the Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford by a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker, who had gone up in a Mustang I at the invitation of a friend who ran the unit and come down convinced that the airframe was wasted on its engine. Harker's report to his own management proposed marrying that low-drag airframe to the Merlin 61, the same two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine being fitted to the newest Spitfires. Rolls-Royce converted a handful of Mustang Is into what they called the Mustang X, work beginning in June 1942, first flight that October, and by November, the converted airframe was reaching speeds and altitudes the Allison version had never approached. Over 430 miles an hour at 22,000 feet, an absolute ceiling above 40,000. Production versions built in America under license by Packard, the V1650, went into the P-51B and P-51C, and the airplane that resulted, a British engine turning inside an airframe with an American wing designed to a British specification, was not a compromise built from 3 different countries' leftovers. It was, by the accounts of the men who flew it on both sides of this story, close to the best all-round piston fighter either country produced. Jerry, the aircraft Fraser flew into captivity on D-Day, was one of those Packard Merlin B-model Mustangs, armed with 4 50-caliber machine guns and carrying the drop tanks that had, by June 1944, turned the whole concept of a fighter escort inside out. Those tanks were, by 1944, often disposable paper and resin composite shells slung under each wing, cheap enough to manufacture in the hundreds of thousands and simply dropped once empty, a small piece of unglamorous industrial engineering that mattered as much to the outcome of the air war as anything happening inside the engine cowling. Part 3. The wreck near Rouen did not stay a wreck for long. German recovery crews secured the airframe, and it proved sound enough to repair and fly rather than scrap for parts, an outcome the Luftwaffe could not always count on with a downed fighter, particularly one recovered amid the chaos of the invasion's first days. It was given the Luftwaffe test code T9 plus HK, repainted in the pale yellow undersides Rechlin used to mark its captured stock, and routed east to the Mecklenburg Lakes, the same test center that had taken apart a captured Spitfire in 1940 and a captured Thunderbolt in November 1943. By the summer of 1944, Rechlin was handling more enemy hardware than at any point earlier in the war, American, British, and Soviet types arriving in a steady trickle, alongside the routine test and development work the Luftwaffe still needed done on its own aircraft, all of it flown by the same small pool of qualified test pilots working against the clock. Jerry was simply the newest arrival in that queue, and, as with the Thunderbolt 7 months earlier, what made it matter was not the runway it landed on, but which of those test pilots happened to be free to fly it, and what he chose to write down afterward. It should be said plainly that the surviving accounts do not fully agree on exactly where Fraser came down. Squadron loss records place it east of Rouen, in the confusion of a fighter sweep gone wrong in low cloud. Lerca's own later recollection, decades on, places the landing closer to Cambrai, considerably further north. This channel would rather note the disagreement than silently pick the version that reads better on screen. What both accounts agree on is the date, the unit, the pilot, and the fact that the airplane came down whole. The parallel was not lost on the men who worked there. 3 times now, in 4 years, the enemy had put one of its frontline fighters into German hands close to whole, and 3 times the honest answer to what Rechlin found in the cockpit had depended entirely on whether Berlin, this time, wanted to hear it. Part 4. The pilot who flew the captured Mustang was, again, Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche, Rechlin's principal test pilot, the same officer who had taken the Thunderbolt Beetle into the air 7 months earlier, and who would go on, by the war's end, to fly more than 120 different aircraft types, Allied and Soviet alike, a career built on the unglamorous professional habit of coming back from every flight with numbers, rather than a reputation to defend. Rechlin, by 1944, kept a stock of captured Allied aviation fuel, specifically so that trials like this one could be flown on the fuel the aircraft had actually been designed to use, rather than on a German substitute that might flatter or cheat the result. A small methodological honesty that says as much about the test center's professional culture as any single verdict it produced. Lerche's account of the Mustang, preserved in the flight records that later formed the basis of his post-war memoir, describes an airplane that impressed him in ways the heavier American fighter had not managed to. He recorded a top speed of roughly 670 kilometers an hour, around 416 miles an hour, at 7,000 meters, close to 23,000 feet. A figure he considered remarkable given what he judged to be a comparatively modest state of tune on the Merlin powering it. Evidence, in his own professional reading, that the speed was coming from the shape of the airplane and not merely from the size of its engine. He found it excellent in a turn, in an era when American fighters were not generally credited by German pilots with matching German aircraft in that particular department. In his own later comparative judgment, only Germany's newest fighters coming into squadron service late in the war, the Focke-Wulf 190D9 and the Messerschmitt Bf-109G10, could stay with it. And those were airplanes representing the last serious refinement German industry had left to give, being asked simply to keep pace with a design North American had frozen 2 years earlier, around an engine built under license from a country Germany had been at war with since 1939. Lerche's report, in other words, said plainly that the best the Luftwaffe had left in the pipeline was being asked to catch up to, not surpass, an airplane built from a British engine bolted into an American airframe that had begun life in 1940 as somebody else's low-altitude reconnaissance fighter. Part 5. What happened to that verdict is where this story stops rhyming with the one about the Spitfire in 1940 and starts rhyming instead with the one about the Thunderbolt. Jerry did not sit at Rechlin gathering dust once the trials were finished. It was handed to Circus Rosarius, the traveling unit under Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius, that this channel has already described touring a captured Thunderbolt to frontline fighter wings, repainted enemy aircraft flown from airfield to airfield so that ordinary Luftwaffe pilots could see the machines they were fighting up close, ask questions of the men who flew them, and in some cases, fly mock engagements against them. Jerry toured Axis air bases through the rest of 1944, performing exactly that role, a captured American fighter teaching German pilots how to survive an encounter with its own kind. The lesson Lerche's flight had made clear was blunt. Do not try to outturn a Mustang. the one advantage German pilots might have assumed they still held against American iron simply did not apply here the way it had against the heavier Thunderbolt. Use altitude, use the dive, use the bounce, and disengage rather than turn, because turning was the one fight this particular American fighter was built to win. Part 6. It would be comfortable to end there, with a German pilot's honest verdict, properly listened to this time, properly taught to frontline units, and a happier outcome than the Spitfire report that Ernst Udet's office had filed and forgotten in 1940. Honesty requires going further. The tactics Circus Rosarius taught were sound, and probably kept a number of young Luftwaffe pilots alive a little longer in the second half of 1944. They did nothing to change the arithmetic working against those pilots every single time they climbed into a cockpit. By the summer of 1944, the Merlin Mustang, fitted with drop tanks, could fly with the bomber stream to Berlin, Munich, Vienna, anywhere the 8th and 15th Air Forces chose to send it, and back on every mission, not merely the shorter ones, at the same time as raids on the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești were beginning to strangle the fuel that German training units needed to give new pilots the flying hours their predecessors had once taken for granted. That single fact, an escort fighter with unlimited reach and a training pipeline running on fumes, repeated day after day through the summer and autumn of 1944, did more damage to the German fighter arms' supply of experienced pilots than any tactic taught on the ground could repair. Circus Rosarius made individual encounters more survivable. It could not make there be fewer Mustangs, and by the last months of 1944, there were thousands of them, over Germany on almost every clear day, flown increasingly by pilots with more flight hours and more fuel in reserve than the men rising to meet them. American fighter pilots reaching squadrons in late 1944 typically carried several hundred hours of flight training behind them. Their German counterparts, drawn from schools starved of aviation fuel by the bombing of synthetic oil plants, were in many cases reaching their first combat sortie with barely 100 hours logged, a gap in raw experience that no briefing from Circus Rosarius could close. What the story of Jerry does prove, cleanly, is something about Rechlin rather than about the wider war. 3 captured fighters, 3 honest test pilots' reports, 3 different outcomes depending on what Berlin was ready to hear in any given year. In 1940, an honest report on the Spitfire went nowhere near a cockpit that mattered. In November 1943, an honest report on the Thunderbolt got airborne within weeks, touring frontline units, and changed how individual pilots fought without changing what they were up against. By June 1944, with an honest report on the Mustang, even a Luftwaffe that had fully absorbed the lesson of listening to its own test pilots could do nothing more than teach its young men how to lose a little more slowly. Against a machine flying escort missions, its own airframe had never originally been designed to fly, on an engine its own country had not originally built. Seen together, the 3 captured fighters this channel has now followed into Rechlin tell a single continuous story about an institution slowly, unevenly, learning to listen to its own honest men, and about how little that learning was worth once the numbers on the other side of the ledger became large enough. A Spitfire ignored in 1940 cost the Luftwaffe nothing it could measure at the time. A Thunderbolt acted on in 1943 bought individual pilots a better chance in a fight they were still, on the whole, losing. A Mustang understood perfectly in 1944 changed nothing at all about the outcome, because by then, the outcome had already been decided somewhere else, in fuel depots and flight schools rather than in any cockpit at Rechlin. Thomas Fraser spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, one name among many thousands taken on the day the war in the West finally turned. A 22-year-old from Atlanta, whose last act at the controls of his own airplane was to make sure his friends overhead knew what had happened to him. Hans Werner Lerche kept flying captured aircraft out of Rechlin until the end, adding the Mustang to a logbook that would eventually run past 120 types, survive the war, and published his own account of it decades later as Luftwaffe test pilot, one of the few honest first-hand records of what it felt like to sit in the enemy's machine and report back the truth about it, whether or not anyone above him chose to act on it. Ronald Harker, the Rolls-Royce pilot whose 30 minutes in a Mustang 1 at Duxford started the whole chain of events, is remembered in aviation histories on both sides of the Atlantic as the man who put the Merlin in the Mustang, a single afternoon's judgment that reshaped an airplane neither country had originally built, the way history would end up needing it built. Jerry itself, the airframe that carried Thomas Fraser into captivity and then carried German pilots through a season of mock combat against its own type, did not survive to the end of the war it had been drafted into on the wrong side. Touring with Circus Rosarius into the winter, it was lost on the 10th of December, 1944, killing the pilot flying it, Oberlieutenant Leo Pacians. The airplane had crossed the Channel as an American fighter, been flown for months as a German training aid, and ended its service the way so many aircraft on both sides of this war did, with a name in a loss report that the surviving record does not always explain further. It is worth setting that name down here, plainly, alongside Fraser's and Lerca's and Harker's, because a machine this thoroughly documented, this widely photographed even in its enemy markings, deserves to have the man who ultimately died in it remembered as well, and not only the pilot who lost it in the first place. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these. More captured aircraft, more honest test pilots, more machines that told the truth to the men who built the fighters meant to beat them, whether or not that truth arrived in time to matter. A radio left switched on over Normandy, a British engine turning inside an American airframe, a German verdict that was, by every measure that counted, completely correct, and completely unable to change what the 6th of June 1944 had already decided.